All right. Good morning, everyone. Hope you enjoyed the first day yesterday of Azure Dev Summit and the keynote this morning, and hope you're ready for day 2 as well. In this talk, I really do not know how to work with React. So my goal is to show you an alternative, which is HTMX, and how that works together with ASP.NET Core, how you can use it to slowly but steadily enrich your current ASP.NET Core applications, for example, make them more rich and make them feel like a React application, but without all of the overheads. Now, a talk like this does not start with live coding. A talk like this starts with some ranting. So let's get into that. If we take a step back, what is it we do as developers? We try to build applications, ideally, and also provide a good user experience so that the user knows and finds their way around the applications that we build and so on. That is our goal. We want to make users and business processes that are automated and just work. Now, do we really need all of those frameworks like React, Angular, Vue, and so on? Do we need them to do that? I would argue not really, because if you want to solve a problem, you have to think about, okay, what framework am I going to use? Do I use Node? Do I use NPM or Yarn? What is my asset pipeline going to look like? Am I going to use Gulp or Grunt or Vite or whatever the server is that is currently the new hotness this month? You have to learn all of those things. And there's so many options, so many choices to make. And are all those choices still going to be around like in 6 months from now? Going further, do we actually really need single-page applications? Because if you build a single-page application, you're kind of opening up a can of worms. All of a sudden, you have to manage state both on the client as well on the server. You have to have an API. You have to make sure that you can log in on the API, make sure that you have identity in the client as well, save some state on the client, keep track of some state on the server, and so on. So there's a lot of things that are involved and actually make it much more complex to build an application that is a single-page application. You also have to think about routing, like what framework are you going to use? Do you want to make sure that the user can just copy a link in their browser, bookmark it, and make sure that they land on the exact same page in the application again afterwards? But if you want to do that, you have to make sure that you keep some state in there as well to make sure that that page can render. All of a sudden, you also have to think about your API. Are you going to use GraphQL or REST? Are you going to do an API design with hypermedia and status codes, like a proper API that you can figure out how it works? Or are you just going to do an HTML as JSON minus the markup kind of API? I see a lot of these in the wild where people just build an API that is essentially returning JSON, where the next best thing you could actually do is just return the HTML with the exact same structure, because you're just building JSON outputs for the exact same thing that you're going to render. Why would you even build an API in that case? But the user experience is an argument that you might think of. Okay, what do we want from user experience? What is it we want to achieve again? Do we want to have nice URLs? Do we want to make sure that we can use the back button and store favorites and so on, have a nice browser history? Do we want to do things like CSS page transitions where you have a nice animation going back and forth between the different screens in your application? Do you want to be able to provide a feature that allows you to do like a control-click to open up a new page in a new tab? Well, if that is what you want, great. We have that already on the client side in the browser. The browser has been doing this for so many years. It does this so well. It does HTTP requests and responses. It has history. It does HTML, CSS, JavaScript. If you want to do hypermedia, guess what? HTML is hypermedia. If you want to provide a link from a list of customers to an actual customer details page, that's a link. It is in there. You are, like in hypermedia, just saying, OK, if you want that information, follow the link. You have all of that today. So do you really need that SPA? But performance is another one that you might come up with. Like user experience, OK, fine, we can solve that. But performance, we need an SPA for performance. Really? Is what you want fast rendering and make sure that if you open up a page, it feels like Snap and it's there? Do you want to have small payloads? Do you want to have some AJAX and so on? We have that already. And by the way, I say AJAX because I'm old school, like XML HTTP requests is what I mean by that, so requests in the background. But all of that is already there. The browser handles all of that for you. You do not need 200 kilobytes of React, for example, to make sure that you have fast rendering. On the contrary, you need 5 kilobytes of HTML, maybe 2 lines of JavaScript. But the user experience, if you look at how we built applications back in 2004, it was just server-side rendering. The browser would render, you would make a request, post something to the server would respond to that, give you new HTML, and work with that. Then at some point, for whatever reason, we came up with this thing like, okay, we need a virtual DOM. We need to make sure that we can manage the DOM in the browser and then swap out the DOM with whatever we just are about to render and so on. We need routing, we need state management, we need a JSON API, some GraphQL. All of that needs a controller on the client, but also a controller on the server, like super complex. Whereas with HTMX, as we will see, you get back into that previous cycle where you just have request response, you react to something that happens on the client, and you can spice it up a little bit to add those user experience kind of things into that entire story. So let's talk about HTMX. HTMX is a library built by one person and a number of contributors, and it's kind of opinionated. On their website, a lot of the website is actually a similar rant to the one that I just gave you about, okay, do we need all this complexity? HTMX is a small library, 49 kilobytes if you don't minify, around 14 kilobytes if you do minify. One JavaScript file that you add into your project, add a script there, and you can get started and work with it. It supports attributes, it has CSS properties, it has headers, a JavaScript API, and so on. But basically what you do is you take your existing HTML that you are rendering, and using that HTML, you're going to spice it up with a couple of things that you can do. So on the example on the slide here, we have the script loading HTMX. We then have a button, and the button has this hx-get attribute defined there, where we say, okay, if you click this button, you make a GET request to this /hello endpoint, and the response you get back, you swap it into the current DOM by replacing the outer HTML. So if that hello endpoint would return simply a string saying hello, the button would disappear after we click it and just render hello. That's all you have to do. No JavaScript, just say, okay, I intend for this button to make a GET request, and the response, I just want to render and swap the outer HTML here. There's a couple of CSS classes and a couple of additional things that you can do, like a lot of people like to have those spinners when you load something and work with that as well. You can do that using this HTMX-indicator CSS class, basically telling HTMX, like, look, if you want to show something like a loading icon whenever a request is in flight, you can render that in there. So quite easy to spice it up. But also, if you think about this and you would remove HTMX again, making that button work would simply be adding a new form, for example, that does the exact same thing. So it's not more complex than what we've been doing. I would even argue that it's actually making it slightly easier because you're defining behavior on one element and what it should be doing. HTMX is HTML if they kept going. That is a quote that is on the website. Basically, the philosophy of HTMX is that any DOM object in your page model and so on can trigger requests, not only forms, not only links, not only buttons, but even if you just have a div somewhere and you hover over it, that could be a trigger for making a request somewhere. Requests can be GET and POST, which the browser typically supports in a server-side rendered scenario. But also, thanks to HTMX, you can do deletes, patch, and all of those things as well if you want to work with those on the server side as well. Any interaction you make through HTMX is going to result in HTML being returned and will update the UI. So any action you do will update the UI somewhere based on whatever trigger happens. And all of the state management is server-side. So when you refresh a page, for example, the idea is that the server would keep all of the states and make sure that the page is rendered basically the way you left it when you hit refresh in the browser. So what does that look like? Let's do a quick hello world here. I've prepared a project where I have HTMX included in my JavaScript files, referenced in my template and so on, and very simple Razor pages where I'm adding some HTML. If I open that one in the browser, my Hello World page, you will see I have a button, and the idea will be that when I click that button, it's going to update that div that is above there that says change me. So let's see if we can do that. I have some HTML in there with that button and with that change me target that is there, so let's see if we can do that. I mentioned that you add attributes if you want to get started with coding. So what I'm going to do is add an HTMX and that HTMX is going to instruct HTMX that this button will make a GET request. I'm not going to add any URL there, so I'm just simply going to say, okay, my GET is going to invoke the current page, empty string, or just leave it empty, whatever you want to do, and then get the result from there. If I now apply the changes, and I refresh that page, damn it. Let's just run all of those and not debug. That's going to be the issue here. Let's go back. Hello world. Yes, there we are. If I now click that, you will see this weird thing where it's actually loading the current page again because it's making that GET request. It's responding with the exact same HTML it rendered at the beginning, and you now see that updated in the page. So let's see if we can make this a little bit nicer. On the server side, what you can do is you can check for a specific header. If my request.headers contains HX requests, I know it's going to be a request coming from HTMX. And at that point, what I can do is return something that says hello, for example, or if I want, of course, I have to make that content, so simply return a content string there. I can even make that HTML if I want to do that. And if you want to make this a little bit nicer, you can do something like this as well, where you say lang equals HTML, and you get syntax highlighting there in VS Code, Writer, and so on. So I will now return hello when I render this thing. Let's save this, refresh our page, click, and you will now see hello on my button. Reason for that is the request was made by having this HXGet attributes that I added to the HTML elements. But by default, the target of the action that you're invoking is going to be the same element that triggered the event. So what I can do is add another attribute there and say, okay, I want to say AHX target equals target, let's call it that, and I need to add my ID there as well. And then I'm going to change this H2 into having an ID that is target. Simply HTML where I say, okay, I have an ID for this element, and I'm going to update that thing as a result of my get that I do. If I now refresh and click, you will see the hello in that other target that is there. So again, very simple to incrementally add additional logic and additional features to the page you currently have. Like that. So no routing, no 50 different frameworks and 700 NPM dependencies, one JavaScript file and 2 attributes. That's what we have here. All right, let's talk about attributes first. If you look at the attributes, we saw HXGet, and every single HTTP method that you can invoke is included as a potential attribute there that HTMX will understand. So you can do get, you can do post, you can do put, patch, whatever you want to do there. Target is defined by this HX target CSS selector, and you can actually make it a little bit more elaborate than just say, okay, this is the target ID or class or whatever. You can also say closest, next, or previous as a modifier. So if you want to update the closest H2, for example, you can say, okay, target equals H2 closest, just to target that specific thing. So a couple of additions over the typical CSS selectors. On requests, you will always see this HX request, which is going to contain a Boolean or a 1 or something like that, where you know that HTMX made the request to your server. We'll see later, there's a couple of additional headers there as well, a couple of additional attributes, of course, as well, but that's what this talk is about. Let's look at a couple more attributes. Back into code. Let's close this one. There we are. I have a server-side page. Let's start with that, the server sides, where on get, I will simply render my page. On get hover, different page handler that I have there, I will return the current time. And then on get search is going to run a search through a list of names and so on, and then return some HTML that contains that list of names as a result. So just to give you a couple of examples of what you can do on the client side, but just so you know what's happening on the server side here. On the client side, I have a couple of things. Let me first show you attributes. It's already working. So I have a couple of things there. Hover me. If I hover this div, it's going to update the time. If I move out and in again, you will see that it will update whenever I hover over that particular element. Second one, also updated the timestamp, but when I enter it again, you will see it's not updating, while the top one is. And then that last one there is just updating every second. How does this work? In the page here, again, we have this hxget, where we are calling that hover handler that is returning the current date time, so we can render that. And as a trigger for that first button, we have mouse enter. So on mouse enter, this will trigger a request to the server, update the timestamp, replace it on my page. The second one, same thing, same trigger, where I have a mouse enter, but that mouse enter has a modifier that says once. So only once will you update this specific element by making that request. Future instances, future hovers, future clicks, or whatever will not be taken into account. And then the third one has a trigger that says every 1 second, where we update simply every 1 second. We have a timer there running and making requests to the server. So if you want to do polling or something like that, it's quite easy. You add an hxget and a trigger that says, OK, based on time, every second, every 5 seconds, make an update to my page. Search, let's build that one. Search is another one where I have a text box, and when I search for my name, I would love it to reach out to the server and then give me a list of names that I can query there. So let's see how you would build that. I have an input type text that does an hxget to search. The name of this text field is Q, so simple HTML. On the server side, you will see that the query there is also Q. So that's going to be the argument or the parameter that I pass in. And then I want to populate this div called search results with the results that come back from the server. So how to go about that? And let me quickly take my notes here. You would have that get, first of all, where you say, OK, I want to reach out to the server. Then we are going to add a target, where we say, OK, the target is going to be my search results div that I want to work with there. And I will also add a trigger. Key up, delay 500 milliseconds. Thanks, AI, for completing my demo, basically. So what this trigger is going to do is whenever my key goes up, like typical DOM event that you could also script in JavaScript, this will trigger a request to the server and update everything that I have in the client. So if I would now refresh, I hope that's going to work. If I type Maarten, yes, it's going to come back with a name. Don't know which names are in there, but yeah, you see it searches and it gets back results from the server. Very easy, again, adding a get, adding a trigger like on key up, and make the request to the server. Now this thing is important. The key up is a trigger, but the modifier here is actually quite nice because it allows you to do things like debouncing, where when you search, you can, for example, wait for 500 milliseconds before sending the request to the server, so that when I type, let's open up the network tab here, so that when I type, yeah, of course, my timer is triggering as well. But when I type, I do not want the speed of my typing to invoke many, many requests. I want to wait 500 milliseconds and only then make the request. So keep basically a buffer of the typing speed that I have there. I can do another one where if I search for, let's say, Maarten, and I remove it and I paste it again, I don't want to keep doing that search if I already did it and there's no real change within those 500 milliseconds. So I can add another modifier where I say, OK, wait for 500 milliseconds, but only trigger if the value actually changed. So that you can, again, make fewer requests to the server if you don't want to make those requests. Point being here is that there's a lot of those modifiers in the documentation and so on. So if you start building, have a look into those, because it's really nice to be able to do things like debouncing, make sure that the value actually changed, and things like that. All right, so what have we seen? The HTTP requests we've seen that you can set the targets. We've seen that request header in one of the first demos, and we've seen that the event trigger can be a number of things. DOM events like change, submit, click, mouse move, mouse enter, things like that. But also there's special events that you can use. We didn't really look at many of those, like every 2 seconds we saw that one. But there's also one that is revealed or intersect. Imagine you are building one of those UIs where you have infinite scrolling. You have 10,000 results from your shopping carts, and you want to make sure that if the user scrolls through, you render 100, and when they reach the end of those 100, you make a request for the second page, you insert it into the DOM, and the user can simply keep scrolling. That is something that you could do with that intersect event, for example, where on the last element or the last item of the list that you're rendering, you add this intersect trigger, and when that event or when that DOM element is going to be in the viewport, it's going to make a request to the server again and then update the page that you are working with. And then also modifiers, we saw once, we saw changed, we saw that delay to make sure that you can actually do things like debouncing and so on. There's also another one where you can add this from and then a selector where I could have a search button, for example, and my search button would be responsible for making the request to the server to make the search work. But I can also say that the event modifier there will also be changed from my text box. So the button makes the requests, but only when the text box changes. So that's another modifier that you can use there. All right, state management. State management is your responsibility. Like I mentioned, it is something that you can do on the server, and you can do that with static fields, cookies, sessions, database, you name it, whatever you want to do. So let's have a look at how that could work. Open up my browser. This one can close and go into state management. I have a counter here, fantastic demo, a button that I can increment, click it, and the number goes up. How is this implemented? On the client side, the HTMX here is quite easy. I have the button that triggers an HX post to my current page. The target is my counter div, and the counter is going to get updated with the number that I have there. Server side, also quite easy. I have, on the first page load, I reset my counter to 0. And whenever someone posts to this page, I'm going to return the count ++, and then also update the state on the server side. Now, of course, I mentioned state is something that you have to manage. So this is not something that you would probably do in a static, because this is going to be static for all of your users that you have. So this is going to be a mess. So if you want to implement state here, you could do something like this, where you have session state, for example, where you store and retrieve an integer and keep that around. This matters because the state is now stored per user. Whenever you make a request or click that button, that state is going to be there. But also, if I would at least remove this line, when I would now reload my page and my counter is at 42 or whatever number that I have there, my state is preserved. So if I now hit my page again and my session is still active, that number is going to start at 42. So this is your state management that you would typically have to jump through a lot of hoops in React. Here it's simply session state, put an integer in there or put whatever value in there, and you have all the scenarios covered. You have the HTMX side covered when you actually want to increment the button or the counter there. But you also have the reload covered, where if someone bookmarks and the session is still there, the data is still going to be there as well. So any one of you doing React and jealous about just using session state? Yes, one. Thank you. My mission is complete here. All right, let's show you a couple more things. Headers. We already saw that when you make a request to the server, that there's this HX request header that's being sent to the server. There's actually a number of additional headers that you can read from the clients, but also a number of headers that you can provide to the clients to do more interesting things. That HX request is available on every request. However, you will see that when a request is made, there's also going to be an HX target, HX trigger name, the event information that you have. So in this case, where I have my counter, this target, for example, is going to be sent in an HX target header as well, so that on the server side, I can potentially make a decision on what the DOM would look like and what information I want to use there. My current URL is also being sent to the server, and I can work with that. And if you look into the documentation, there's a bunch of additional headers just to get information about the events that happened on the page. So if you really want to go wild and server-side pick which elements to work with or what the trigger was and so on, you can actually look into that. Response headers, there's also a number. You can provide a client-side redirect, where instead of doing a server-side redirect, you can say, OK, HX location is this URL. Nice thing about that is you will do a client-side redirect, but also history will be preserved. So you will have the back button working there as well. If you want to put an additional URL somewhere in the page history that you have in the browser, you can say HX push URL and return a header that contains that URL, and you will store that in the state there as well. If you simply want to do refresh, return HX refresh as the header. If you want to retarget, for example, the client side says, okay, my target is this H2, but on the server you know that you want to target a different element, you can retarget that from the server side. And also you can trigger events on the client side as well. So you could have a button that increments a number, but then the server can say, okay, also invoke this other event that may make another request and so on, and kind of cascades through a number of events to update your current page that you have. I know, theoretical, so let's have a look at that. Right, headers. I'll maybe first show you the page. There we are. I can click, and you will see that this thing changed. My first div that is on the page. If you look at the page, however, it is actually doing what I expect. So I have an hxget on that button. I'm targeting targets, and when I click it, my ID updates and says, okay, this thing has been worked on. However, I have another element here called other targets, and maybe I want to target that one and make that decision on the server. The way to go about that is to add a header to the request or to the response that you will send back to the user. Let me quickly take my notes here again. So in my response, AI is revealing a couple of things from my demo here for some reason. Anyway, it's easy. I can add a header that says hx retarget and say, okay, I want to target other targets. I can decide that on the server. If I now refresh my page and click, oh, god damn it, restart the page, or restart the application. If I now reload this page and click the button, you will see the second element gets updated. So I have client-side code saying, okay, target this element, but maybe at some point you want to retarget based on whatever you're doing. So imagine you're building a shopping cart or something, and your target is typically, okay, replace the thing with added to cart, whatever you want to do there. Maybe you want to retarget to update the cart items that are there somewhere on the page. That's also something that you could do there. So that when you click, your target is going to be retargeted if you add or remove an item from your cart there. What else can you do? I can also trigger events. Let's say trigger, and I want to trigger an event called some events. All right. On my page itself, I have some JavaScript where I have an event listener on my page body that listens to some events. And when that event is triggered, it will show me an alert. I know, very dull demo and so on, but just to give you an idea that from the server side, I can actually trigger JavaScript events if I want to do so with HTMX. If I now restart my page or restart my application, my target is going to be the other target, but I also want to trigger some event on the client side. So if I click this one, you will see that event is also triggered, simply by on the server saying, look, this event, trigger it and do something with it. I'm actually going to go into my comments here to use this one. Very lazy coding here. I'm going to trigger some other events in this case, and I'm going to provide some additional JSON data to that event as well. So maybe when you, from the server, want to trigger an event on the client side, maybe you want to give it some additional data. Well, you can by passing in whatever JSON you have there. And on the client side, I have my detail.message detail.whatever, and that is really looking into the JSON that I'm providing there. I guess you want to see this, so I'll again restart my application. Come on. Yes, there we are. Click, and I now get a message from some other event that says, here is a message. So that comes from the JSON that my server is passing into my clients. Again, very easy to do. Simply add a header and trigger the event with whatever metadata you want to have in there. Now, some of you might have noticed that I have this trigger after settle and no longer trigger. Like, what's up with that? HX trigger typically triggers immediately when the response goes to the server. However, if you want to control when the event on the client side is fired, you can actually say, okay, trigger after settle, which means the DOM is going to be updated first, so all of my UI is going to be updated first, and only then this event is going to be triggered. Might be important because if you don't do it and you expect the user to already see some changed HTML before you actually trigger a JavaScript event, you want to be able to influence like the order in which those things happen. Lastly, a good friend of mine also wrote a library called HTMX.net. I would really recommend you to install that one. We'll see some additional examples as well. But this one makes it easier to declaratively add those event triggers and so on into your application. So my trigger after settle here is basically done by saying response.htmx with trigger some other event, and then the data that I want to have in there. Just to give you a little bit of an idea of how to work more nicely with this and not just pass in the raw data into the header that you're returning there. All right. HTMX.net. Let's talk a little bit about that one. It actually makes HTMX a little bit better for .NET developers. It has some utilities for request and response where you can check, is this an HTMX request, for example, set those headers that you saw, and so on. There's also a package called HTMX.tag helpers that also helps you with auto-completion and so on of all those different attributes that you may have in your Razor pages. So let's have a quick look there. This check for the header HTMX.request can be done by saying, okay, if request.isHTMX comes from that library, slightly easier to read and a little bit less error prone if you miss or mistype the header name that is there. We already saw this response.htmx where you can add with trigger and so on. You can also change those, chain those things, so you could say with target, for example, or reswap. All of the headers that you would typically return there are exposed here, where you can say, okay, I want to do a redirect or refresh or whatever you want to do there. So if I want to retarget, I can also do that using this library. On the Razor Pages side, you will get hxget and all of those things as tag helpers, but also if you want to see hx.controller and so on, all of this auto-completion actually comes from that library and will give you a little bit of an easier time to work with all of the different tools that are there. Couple of additional things there. Typically, you would do an hxget or an hxpost and so on. Library also allows you to set an hxpage and an hxpage handler, making it easier to target your Razor Pages applications to figure out, okay, what am I going to call and what am I going to work with. All right, back to slides and into the next thing. There's a lot more things in HTMX. I'm not going to cover all of those, but I would encourage you, if this triggers your interests, to also have a look in the documentation. There's a lot of things that you can do in terms of animations, boosting pages that don't really need Ajax, but you simply want to load through the client side, WebSockets, server-sent events, and all of those things. So have a look at those, but I'm going to cover a couple more of these and a couple of other things as well, just to further, hopefully, pique your interests. Let's create a type ahead in ASP.NET Core, Razor Pages, but using HTMX. The idea here would be, again, to build something where we have a page where we have a list of names, email addresses, and so on, with a search box on top, and that you can use search to search for. I'm not sure if it actually wired up. Yes. So it works without HTMX as well. I can click the button and I can search. If I clear this and search again, you will see I get my full list and so on. How does this work? Relatively easy page where I have my input elements. Modal binds to a query that is on my Razor page. And then whenever I click the button, I submit my form and I will do a search. Server side, what does this look like? I have an onGet that checks my fake database for the people who are in there, runs the query and so on, and then returns the page with my results set to the model that I'm returning. And that means that in my type ahead page itself, I can now render a partial that contains basically a for each going through everything that is in my model. So not rocket science, I would think, something that you would typically build in Razor Pages or MVC, typical scenario there. Now let's see how we can spice this up and make it work with HTMX. In my type ahead, I'm going to update my button a little bit, or my text box there a little bit by adding some HTMX. So what this will do, I will add an hxget where I say, okay, whenever someone types into this thing, it will trigger an event, and I will make a get request to my server. The get request is going to my page, and this is, again, htmx.net, the library, where I can say, okay, my page is going to be 05_typeahead, and I can make use of my current page to trigger it. I'm then going to add a target, where I say, okay, whenever this thing is invoked, can you please target my, what's the name of the element? Search results. So I'm going to add that one as well. And then, just like before, I'm going to add a trigger. Why do I keep typing HG? I'm going to add a trigger that says on key up. Whenever someone is typing, I will again add that delay of 500 milliseconds to do some debouncing there. And I'm also going to make sure that the value actually changed. And I really should type better on a Tuesday morning. So that's it. That's been added. On the server side, I can now go into my type ahead. And on the server side, I will add a small change here. Instead of simply returning my page that renders the entire page, which if I would now refresh and I would start typing, let's say Kim, it would again inject my entire page. So I want to make sure that I'm only returning this partial view that I have. And the good thing is, you might think, okay, how would I do that? ASP.NET Core already has all of those things. So if you have an HTMX request coming in, you would say, okay, return partial, my type ahead view that has my entire model there as well. I will have to restart again because this is a breaking change to the flow. Yes, there we are. Come on. There we are. If I now type and I search for this Kim, for example, you will see it's not working. Okay, what did I mess up? Oh yeah, I don't want to render my type heads. This is AI coding in action. This view does not exist, so that's the reason why this is failing. I actually want to have my, let me copy it from here, my type ahead search results partial view there to render the model. And let's retry. And we should now have a page where I can search. Yes, it renders the view by simply returning the partial view that I was already using on the page to render it when it was fully server-side, and then I can work with that. Let's add a couple of additional things. On my page, you will see that I have this loading indicator that is linked to my HTMX indicator class that has a spinner and would show like it's loading. To hook that up, I can also add a HX indicator. And that one's going to be my loading ID that I have down there, so this one. And if I would now refresh and load again, you should see, yes, it was very brief, but you saw the search or the spinner was there in the button, right? So if I remove it again, you will see it very briefly. I'll do it a couple times more. But this is how you could add a spinner there if you know you have longer running operations or something like that. So again, one attribute, link up the element you want to show, and HTMX will make sure that all of these things work as you would expect. Cool. Another scenario when coming from ASP.NET would be validation. But before we go in there, ASP.NET Core is actually very handy or very useful to work together with HTMX. As we saw in the demo, you can have your full view with a layout that renders a partial view and so on. But when you make the HTMX request, you can also return a partial view that just renders that part of the page. That is infrastructure that is already in ASP.NET Core, very easy to use and quite handy when working with HTMX. If you're using view components or tag helpers and things like that, you can also do that, have some server-side logic and just render a couple of tags that you require from the server. All right, let's talk about validation. Very often, validation is something that can be done client-side, like this field is required, for example. That is something that you can easily do on the client side. This field should match a specific regular expression or whatever, can be done on the client side. But imagine you are building a form where you are requesting a user's email address, and instead of just doing the typical regular expression check, you actually want to make a request to their DNS server, check if there's proper MX records, and make sure that the email address actually is configured, at least has some server listening to the email that you might send to there. How would you do that? Typically, very split brain kind of approach where you would have some client-side validation, click the button, then have the server do some action and maybe re-render the page and so on. HTMX would actually make that one thing where you would do all the validation on the server side, and it would make things a little bit easier. So let's look at that demo there. I have a page called validation, and let's go into that one first. I will request a first name, so let's add myself there. Let's add a domain that hopefully does not exist. And if I add this one, you should see this is not a valid email domain. That request or that validation actually ran on the server side, did a request to my DNS server and so on, or the of this non-existent domain, and made sure that this email address would actually have a mail server listening to it or not. So this one is not valid, and the server did all of the validation. What does this look like in code? I have my validation page there. I have a form for my modal.person, where I do simple modal binding and so on for my first name, last name, email, and all of the things that are in there. And when I submit, I will submit to my server. My server is going to take into my post, do a sleep of 1 second just to make sure that I'm actually spending some time there doing some action, and then running my validation, checking for duplicates, but also checking the DNS to make sure it's actual valid, a valid email address or potentially valid email address. If not, add model state.add model error. If it's valid, I will add it to the database. If it's not valid, I will simply return my page, and if it's HTMX, I will return my form. So partial view if it's HTMX. If it's not HTMX, just return the full page again and make it work. Now, if you look at the URL bar, yeah, so you saw that the browser was spinning there. I actually did not use HTMX here yet. So this is typical without HTMX, how you would wire up this form, do the validation server side, and then make it work. My tab is not visible? Is that something on your end? Yes, thank you. So if I click there, you would see that the browser tab there is loading because there's nothing there. I'm simply going through this as I would without HTMX. Now let's see how we can make this a little bit better and make it feel like it's actual client-side validation. I'm simply going to, in the interest of time, restore some of the things that I did there. So what this form is going to do is, when I don't use HTMX, simply post to the page and make sure it all works. If I use HTMX, it's going to post also to my validation page. It's going to swap the entire element with whatever result comes back. And I want to trigger things on a specific event. The trigger here is going to be submit, because that's a default for a form, so I didn't add an explicit trigger. However, I did add something else, which is this attribute called underscore. Underscore is actually hyperscript in action, and hyperscript is a library that the author of HTMX is also providing you to work together with HTMX to make it all a little bit nicer to work with. So before I dig into what this is, let me show you what's going to happen if I submit here. So if I now click my add button, this is simply going to work again, but you will now see no loading spinner in my browser, and my add button now has a spinner in the add button there, and it's also becoming disabled when I click it. So it does feel like it's client-side now, right? The way this spinner and this disabling and so on works is thanks to this underscore and this hyperscript library that is there. I'm not going to dig into too deep, but just to give you an idea, hyperscript can listen to HTMX events like before sending the request to the server, and I can set my submit button disabled to disabled, add button outline primary none, and remove my primary just to make sure that the styling changes a little bit. And I want to do that when submit button is clicked. So hyperscript actually makes it possible to also make it look a little bit better on the client side as well. You don't have to use it. You can do this all with JavaScript, listen to that event, update the document object model there as well. But this is kind of nice. If you get used to the syntax a little bit, you can make this look a little bit nicer. So hyperscript, again, have a look at it if you're interested in HTMX. It's a really good companion to the library. You don't have to use it, but it does make things a little bit more descriptive if you want to change the clients. Out of band swaps. I have time for another demo. Out of band swaps. So far, we've seen that whenever you update something, it's also going to return some HTML that updates either the element that you clicked or that triggered the events, or some other target that is there. What if you want to update multiple elements? Let's say you are building a shopping cart, and when you add something to your shopping cart, you want to update the page and say, this has been added, but maybe in your header, there's this counter saying, okay, there's 1, 2, 5 items in your cart. How do you go about updating both the page, but also that thing in the header? Yes, I'll show you the demo first. Go back to Writer here. All right. Actually, let me show you in the browser first. Okay, out-of-band swaps. I have a web shop for typical Belgian things that you would buy when you're in Belgium. I can get Belgian waffles, which is not the correct name. There's different Belgian waffles if you want to get into waffles. But let's add this one into my cart. I can click it, and it adds a thumbs up next to my button. Let's also add some chocolates. That updates, and add some chocolate waffles. As you will see, my cart items here are still 0, which is not great. I want to also update that counter that is on the top right of my shopping cart here, instead of just having the thumbs up in the button. How do you go about that? Well, in my navigation bar, for my carts, I can actually do something where from the server side, I return this element, but I say with a specific HTMX attribute, like, look, if you encounter this ID, this cart count, replace it with this piece of HTML that I'm returning to you. So I can do that, and I'm going to do it like this. Return my cart count, exactly the same code that I had in my view, with one attribute that says hx swap out of bands equals true. And if I now re-render or restart my application, we should have all of that working, where my button is going to be added to cart with a thumbs up, but also my cart is going to update. So let's try it. Add to cart. You will now see the thumbs up, but you'll also see the count there going up, which is nice and a really good approach to work with all of that. Out-of-band swaps, you can easily do those with that hx swap out-of-band attribute in HTMX. Easy to use, but once you have a more complex view that has multiple elements that you want to update, maybe cascade different updates on the page as well, you want to use triggers there and kind of rethink how you go about this. So let's look at another example that I have here, my out-of-band swaps with events. Same page, I can add to cart. You will see that the number goes up, so nothing functionally changed. However, the implementation is slightly different. If we look at the implementation, my server side has changed into returning added to cart on the button, but also returning a header that says with trigger cart changed. Not adding like what's the number of items in my cart, not adding anything else. I'm just saying, okay, I trigger an event that says the cart has changed. In my HTML code, I have that button again where I post, and that will update with saying added to cart, thumbs up. But my navigation bar now has a cart counts, or an element that keeps track of the cart counts, but listens to a trigger called cart changed on my entire body. So if an event comes from my body that says cart changed, it will make a request to cart counts and update that value in the UI. I know a couple of additional steps here, but what happens here is that I'm making this more reactive, where I'm simply listening to whatever I'm updating on the page, or whatever event comes from the server, and if cart changed is indeed triggered, I will make another request to the server to update the cart count there. The downside here is I'm making multiple requests, and my second request to update the cart count is only going to be triggered when I actually invoke the first request on the server, but it makes it much more maintainable. Like if you have those elements that need to be updated based on whatever event happens from the server, this will make your page a lot more maintainable by putting the responsibility of updating the inner content of that element to that specific element. All right, anything else I want to show here? No, that'll be it. So this with trigger, maybe one more thing here. If I reload my page and I click Add to Cart, you will see that the thumbs up appears virtually at the same time as the cart count going up. Like it's very close. The reason for that is that I'm using this with trigger and not with trigger after settle, where basically I'm saying, okay, HTML or document object model, when this event happens, make the request immediately and update whenever you want to do it. Let's not wait for the button content to be updated. And it actually gives you a feeling of it all being real time and from the same request, but it's actually making multiple requests. All right, what else do we have? Modals and prompting. Typical scenario that you might have in your page as well, where you want to show a modal form where you add for where you request for additional information, or you want to prompt like, okay, are you sure you want to delete this item from your cart, and things like that. I will say modals are not as beautiful as I would love them to be in HTMX, but they're still doable. Reason that they're not that beautiful is that typically the framework that you're using to render a modal can be Bootstrap, can be whatever framework you want to use, so you have to do some infrastructure there yourself. But if we go to my dialog here and I want to subscribe to newsletter, you will see a modal that now asks for first name, last name, and email address. I can subscribe. I'm subscribed now. That modal was rendered from the server. So you will see if I go to my dialog page there is no modal form on the page. I'm not rendering all of that HTML content when it's not needed, but when I click that button, I do want to render that modal dialog that is there. The way this works is, again, on the button, when I click, I will call the modal form. My modal on the server side is going to render a partial view that contains my modal form. The modal form itself is going to be HTML codes that would typically go into a Bootstrap modal form to render the contents of that thing. And the main infrastructure that I needed to add here was a div that says modals go here, and add a div that says modal content, and then in my HTMX basically say target my modals here. So that's the thing that I'm adding there. Right, I see I have not much time left, so I'm going to skip. Well, maybe I can show you quickly this one without showing the slides. Prompting. I mentioned prompting is typically also a scenario that you might see in different applications. When I delete, I can do that and show something like this where you can say, okay, are you sure, with a nice looking prompt, or something like this where you say, okay, type delete to confirm. Adding something like that is built into HTMX, so you can easily do that and say, okay, I have an HX delete and an HX confirm, are you sure? So when I now click this button, it will invoke delete and swap the outer HTML with deleted, whatever comes back from the server. But adding this HX confirm attribute there is something that is built into the library again that will show a dialog and say, are you sure? Do you want to confirm whether you want to delete or not? Same thing with that prompt. There's an HX prompt parameter that you can use, which will basically render whatever you want to have in that prompt, and then you can use the value of that prompt on the server side to see what's going on. So on the server side, if I want to check that, I can again use my isHTMX, parse the HTMX headers, and then check for the prompt header to be there. If that is really delete, or in this case not empty, I can do the delete. So again, relatively easy to wire up, but very rich to make your UI a lot more rich to work with. All right, what else do I have? A couple of slides to close the session. All right, let's start with that. Yes, in conclusion, if you want to build server-side applications with a client-side feel, HTMX is a perfect fit. You don't always have to reach for React or Vue or Angular or whatever. You can also do simple request response with Razor Pages, MVC, whatever you want to use there. Bring in some HTMX to get that client-side feel of how you interact with the page and so on. In HTMX, things to remember, any document object model element can trigger requests. So not only buttons, not only links, not only forms, can be an image, can be a div, can be whatever you have there. Any interaction will result in HTML and will typically also update the UI. There's a bunch of other things that you can do, like retargeting, updating a different element, control that from the client, control that from the server using headers and so on, to basically make the flow a little bit nicer. But again, every single interaction is going to work with HTML and return some HTML. ASP.NET Core has all the building blocks to work with HTMX. You can return your full view to render the entire page. You can return a partial view if you just want to render one component. There's view components or tag helpers that you can use as well, depending on what you prefer there. Modal binding is there as well, which is also nice if you want to do things like that validation. You can render everything on the server in that component and then modal bind and just check everything on the server as well. And if you start working with HTMX, I can highly recommend HTMX.net as a library just to add the few missing pieces of integrating HTMX with ASP.NET Core. With that, thank you and enjoy the rest of the conference.